Chapter 15 Part B. He took me down lower on the shore, and I saw for myself that his footsteps and mine were the only footsteps printed off on the sand. "How does the fishing village bear, standing where we are now?" asked Sergeant Cuff. "Cobb's Hole," I answered, "that being the name of the place, bears as near as may be, due south." "I saw the girl this evening, walking northward along the shore, from Cobb's Hole," said the sergeant. "Consequently, she must have been walking towards this place." "Is Cobb's Hole on the other side of that point of land there? And can we get to it, now it's slow water, by the beach?" I answered, yes, to both those questions. "If you'll excuse my suggesting it, we'll step out briskly," said the sergeant. "I want to find the place where she left the shore, before it gets dark." We had walked, I should say, a couple of 100 yards towards Cobb's Hole, when Sergeant Cuff suddenly went down on his knees on the beach, to all appearance seized with a sudden frenzy for saying his prayers. "There's something to be said for your marine landscape here, after all," remarked the sergeant. "Here are a woman's footsteps, Mr. Betteridge. Let us call them Rosanna's footsteps, until we find evidence to the contrary that we can't resist. Very confused footsteps, you will please to observe, purposely confused, I should say. Ah, poor soul, she understands the detective virtues of sand as well as I do. But hasn't she been in rather too great a hurry to tread out the marks thoroughly?" "I think she has. Here's one footstep going from Cobb's Hole, and here is another going back to it. Isn't that the toe of her shoe pointing straight to the water's edge? And don't I see 2 heel marks further down the beach, close at the water's edge also? I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I'm afraid Rosanna is sly. It looks as if she had determined to get to that place you and I have just come from, without leaving any marks on the sands to trace her by. Shall we say that she walked through the water from this point till she got to that ledge of rocks behind us, and came back the same way, and then took to the beach again where those 2 heel marks are still left?" "Yes, we'll say that. It seems to fit in with my notion that she had something under her cloak, when she left the cottage." "No, not something to destroy, for, in that case, where would have been the need of all these precautions to prevent my tracing the place at which her walk ended? Something to hide is, I think, the better guess of the two. Perhaps, if we go on to the cottage, we may find out what that something is." At this proposal, my detective fever suddenly cooled. "You don't want me," I said. "What good can I do?" "The longer I know you, Mr. Betteridge," said the sergeant, "the more virtues I discover. Modesty, oh dear me, how rare modesty is in this world, and how much of that rarity you possess. If I go alone to the cottage, the people's tongues will be tied at the first question I put to them. If I go with you, I go introduced by a justly respected neighbor, and a flow of conversation is the necessary result. It strikes me in that light. How does it strike you?" Not having an answer of the needful smartness as ready as I could have wished, I tried to gain time by asking him what cottage he wanted to go to. On the sergeant describing the place, I recognized it as a cottage inhabited by a fisherman named Yolland, with his wife and 2 grown-up children, a son and a daughter. If you will look back, you will find that, in first presenting Rosanna Spearman to your notice, I have described her as occasionally varying her walk to the shivering sand, by a visit to some friends of hers at Cobb's Hole. Those friends were the Yollands, respectable, worthy people, a credit to the neighborhood. Rosanna's acquaintance with them had begun by means of the daughter, who was afflicted with a misshapen foot, and who was known in our parts by the name of Limping Lucy. The 2 deformed girls had, I suppose, a kind of fellow feeling for each other. Anyway, the Yollands and Rosanna always appeared to get on together, at the few chances they had of meeting, in a pleasant and friendly manner. The fact of Sergeant Cuff having traced the girl to their cottage, set the matter of my helping his inquiries in quite a new light. Rosanna had merely gone where she was in the habit of going, and to show that she had been in company with the fisherman and his family was as good as to prove that she had been innocently occupied so far, at any rate. It would be doing the girl a service, therefore, instead of an injury, if I allowed myself to be convinced by Sergeant Cuff's logic. I professed myself convinced by it accordingly. We went on to Cub's Hole, seeing the footsteps on the sand, as long as the light lasted. On reaching the cottage, the fisherman and his son proved to be out in the boat, and limping Lucy, always weak and weary, was resting on her bed upstairs. Good Mrs. Yolland received us alone in her kitchen. When she heard that Sergeant Cuff was a celebrated character in London, she clapped a bottle of Dutch gin and a couple of clean pipes on the table, and stared as if she could never see enough of him. I sat quiet in a corner, waiting to hear how the sergeant would find his way to the subject of Rosanna Spearman. His usual roundabout manner of going to work proved, on this occasion, to be more roundabout than ever. How he managed it is more than I could tell at the time, and more than I can tell now. But this is certain, he began with the royal family, the primitive Methodists, and the price of fish, and he got from that, in his dismal, underground way, to the loss of the Moonstone, the spitefulness of our first housemaid, and the hard behavior of the women servants generally towards Rosanna Spearman. Having reached his subject in this fashion, he described himself as making his inquiries about the lost diamond, partly with a view to find it, and partly for the purpose of clearing Rosanna from the unjust suspicions of her enemies in the house. In about a quarter of an hour from the time when we entered the kitchen, good Mrs. Yolland was persuaded that she was talking to Rosanna's best friend, and was pressing Sergeant Cuff to comfort his stomach and revive his spirits out of the Dutch bottle. Being firmly persuaded that the sergeant was wasting his breath to no purpose on Mrs. Yolland, I sat enjoying the talk between them, much as I have sat, in my time, enjoying a stage play. The great Cuff showed a wonderful patience, trying his luck drearily this way and that way, and firing shot after shot, as it were, at random, on the chance of hitting the mark. Everything to Rosanna's credit, nothing to Rosanna's prejudice. That was how it ended, try as he might, with Mrs. Yolland talking 19 to the dozen, and placing the most entire confidence in him. His last effort was made, when we had looked at our watches, and had got on our legs previous to taking leave. "I shall now wish you good night, ma'am," says the sergeant. "And I shall only say, at parting, that Rosanna Spearman has a sincere well-wisher in myself, your obedient servant. But, oh dear me, she will never get on in her present place, and my advice to her is, leave it." "Bless your heart alive, she is going to leave it," cries Mrs. Yolland. Nota bene. I translate Mrs. Yolland out of the Yorkshire language into the English language. When I tell you that the all-accomplished Cuff was every now and then puzzled to understand her until I helped him, you will draw your own conclusions as to what your state of mind would be if I reported her in her native tongue.